Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And this one feels like a real dilemma, both for leaders and for everyone. I'll just say I've struggled with this one myself as a person who would like to think of himself as compassionate, but isn't necessarily perceived that way by others a lot of the time. And oftentimes my excuse is about the question last. So we're here today. For those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work. Every so often, we take one of your questions and bring in a friend and try to address it. And if you want to find the compendium of past questions, they're edited and available at thisisnotadvice.work. And Massimo is somebody who I met through I don't even know what to call it, a personal development program, group therapy. I don't know. It's called the Hoffman process. We met through one of its follow-up programs, something that was really transformational for me in my life. And I came back and said, hey, I just took a week of vacation to do this thing and told my team, the company will pay for it if you want to go and you don't have to take a week of vacation because it's was so helpful to me in reflecting on myself. And Massimo, I came to learn, although we didn't talk about our work stuff, had worked at a lot of big companies like Nintendo and Salesforce and other places, and then moved toward being an executive coach focused on compassion. And so if I got any of that wrong, you can correct me. The question today is, I'm working in a high stress environment. I feel like there are things that need to get done. How can I show more compassion in that kind of environment? And thank you for offering any and all perspective.
Yeah, well, first, Roy, thanks for having me. And this is a topic that I'm deeply passionate about, one that I think is needed across the board in all organizations now more than ever, but deeply passionate about it because of my own experience with it. You had mentioned that we had met through the Hoffman process, and on my own journey before going there, I also thought that I was a compassionate person. I thought that I was empathetic. I had received feedback that wasn't so much the case. And I really didn't know what I didn't know. And I had received feedback, as many leaders do, around, hey, here are the things you need to work on. And I kept trying to work on those things, but I wasn't able to actually make the type of progress that I wanted to see, certainly not fast enough. And it was when I went through the Hoffman process that I first learned about this idea of self-compassion, specific to compassion, but compassion for ourselves. And I didn't understand it. I didn't know what it was. It was a completely new term for me. And when I think about our ability to be compassionate towards others, it starts with our ability to be compassionate towards ourselves. It seems like that's backwards. And frankly, it's also harder to be compassionate towards ourselves because we have really strong inner critics and we're judging ourselves so hardly as whether we're good or bad or worthy or not. Social comparison happens rampantly, especially within, social media. And there's so much information for us to compare to one another. But if you can actually start with practicing compassion for yourself, you can then be more compassionate for other people because you've internalized it. You know what it means, and your reserves are full. You have capacity to do that.
And so let me ask. So I think I believe that now. I've come to believe that after learning about it for a long time. And we've talked about, is it Kristen Neff, the writer on self-compassion, who's got great talks on YouTube, and reading her stuff is terrific. The challenge that I often have with it, I've come to be convinced that if you said, well, if somebody else did that, would you be upset that they did it? And if the answer is no, then you got to let yourself off the hook, because otherwise it's a form of arrogance. Oftentimes an absence of self-compassion is, to me, I realize, a form of arrogance. And so that helped me let it go. But one of the things I struggle with is, where's the line between, or maybe this isn't the right way to think about it, how do you relate accepting inferior performance in a work environment and self-compassion? Well, I fucked up that presentation, but hey, I'm a human being. We all fuck up sometimes. It's all right. And before you know it, you're fucking up more often and kind of letting yourself off the hook. That's the fear that's alive in me around it. That, the absence of compassion is about high standards. And so how do you resolve that? Is that a tension? And if so, how do you resolve it?
It is a tension, and it's based in a false belief. And Kristen Neff's work is brilliant. I couldn't recommend it enough. And through all the research that she has done, we live in a society where we have leaders that believe I'm going to perform better when I'm hard on myself. We have a badge of honor of, I worked so hard. I worked on the weekends. I'm always so busy.
Well, this is what leaders tell us, right? I mean, only the paranoid survive. And, the way I did it. So, I remember when I started a company, just to interrupt with a story on this, we had a VC who, invested. And he said, in my old job, we used to say, if you don't come in on Saturday, don't bother coming in on Sunday. And I was like, well, you're an idiot, because I knew enough at that point to discard that. But it was scary hearing that. And at that point, I was a relatively independent, person in no category discriminated against. Like if I had been a woman of color, I can't imagine how something like that would have landed with me.
Horrific.
Yeah.
But this is a misunderstood thing about compassion, is that it is not something that lets you off the hook. And when someone practices self-compassion, they are more resilient, because compassion, differently than empathy, isn't just about allowing yourself to feel hurt or anxious or jealous or whatever the emotion might be, but it is about taking action. So compassion for another person is, I empathize with you and I want to alleviate your suffering. Let's take action.
So how can you be self-compassionate in that way? Like, let's take the live example of, maybe I'll ask you for a little live coaching before we wrap here, of like, hey, I could have invested in this company and I made an incorrect judgment about the founder. I thought he sucked at sales. It turned out he was great at sales. Meeting earlier today. What does self-compassion mean if not letting myself off the hook?
So there's three key pieces to it. The first is common humanity, which is, you're not the only person, Roy, who's made poor decisions.
Sure, but there's a lot of shitty investors out there, goes the inner critic.
Right. And not just shitty investors, but you're just not alone. You're smart. You have a record of success, and yet we still sometimes misread people. We make
Sure. So even the best investors misread people sometimes. Even
the best. And so recognizing that there's a common humanity is the direction to go, as opposed to isolation. I made a bad decision. I'm untrustworthy in this regard.
Yeah.
The second piece is mindful awareness. And so this is recognizing, yeah, I really screwed up there. I let myself down. I'm feeling disappointed with myself. And by recognizing it and labeling it, that feeling gives you data. You go,
my inner critic is amazing at awareness. So we're good on that.
But the inner critic is telling you what's right or wrong. It's being judgmental. What I'm talking about is not being judgmental.
Okay, but so, sorry, I should just say the inner critic's judgment makes mindful awareness feel relatively easy. The piece that you've added, which I think is powerful, is an awareness of the effect on my emotional state. I feel embarrassed, or I am disappointed in myself, or something like that.
Absolutely. And what you're talking, the inner critic is our internal voice. It knows us very well. So it knows the triggers, it knows what to say. And all inner critics speak in certainty, in absolutes. It's black or white. You are this or that. There's no curiosity and there's no objectivity.
Totally.
So what I'm saying is that when we're being mindfully aware of our emotions, that we're actually objective, it makes sense that I'm feeling frustrated. I made an error here. I made a poor judgment.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I want to alleviate that suffering or that frustration. I've kind of objectified the emotion, and now I can put it down and move on from it. When we don't do that, people ruminate on it, and you'll spend the whole day.
Your point there is that the purpose of mindful awareness, and I know this from meditation and other things, is allowing that sensation of judgment to pass.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I find that too. Beat yourself up for a second. That's the bad way to let it pass, but that awareness does. And then, I want to let you get to your third piece, but what my inner critic finds itself thinking is, wow, but if I were a crappy investor and couldn't tell the difference between mindful awareness of an error and letting myself off the hook, I'd be saying the exact same things to myself. Well, even the greatest investors make mistakes. Well, sure. Anyway, but sorry, get to the third thing, but I'm just giving you the live narration of the inner critic.
Yeah. And I think the third thing is about taking action on that. Whether you're a crappy investor or you're quite talented, you still need to take action and say, what can I learn from this situation? I don't want to make that mistake again. Yes. And that's one of the misunderstood elements of compassion, that it's not about letting yourself off the hook. It actually, the research shows that it actually perpetuates more motivation to change.
I love that.
Because I'm taking ownership. I recognize I'm feeling this way. I don't want to feel this way anymore.
I have long suspected this, just to say. So what you're saying is that the Andy Grove mentality of only the paranoid survive, and the kind of the mentality that I learned from many of the people who were role models to me, who I now see were like white men mostly. There are many women who were role models, but there were, the people saying this, who had somebody to help take care of everything domestically and ... And they said, show up at the office as early as possible and leave as late as possible, roughly. I mean, that's not what every one of them said. Some of them were more understanding than that. But what you're saying is that they were actually wrong, that would produce higher performance, that there is a strategy that is superior to that in terms of both performance and emotional well-being or mental well-being.
Across the board. And any organization out there that says we want to be a compassionate culture, it has to start with people understanding how to be compassionate towards themselves. Because if you can't do that, your inner critic is going to run rampant.
It doesn't mean tolerant. It doesn't mean necessarily even forgiving, although it can be associated with some of those things. I love that. And then maybe, and so what you're saying is you do that, the compassion for others will follow on roughly the same formula or a different formula?
It's the same formula. You want to understand what their feeling is. You want to recognize that. What's the data that it's telling this person or you, and then help them alleviate that pain. It's about holding people accountable and recognizing what it is. If someone made a mistake, you can empathize with, hey, it really sucks. You're hurting right now. You need to make a mistake. And let's not wallow in that. Let's take action.
All right. I'm going to ask you one more thing. Sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, you're okay.
Which is oftentimes the thing I struggle with is I feel I'm just in a neutral tone, talking objectively about the issue at hand. But the recipient, in part because I'm like an East Coast, typical, stereotypical, whatever, feels I'm being harsh on them and therefore lacking compassion because the tone is hard and not soft. And I'm curious to what degree you think that that's a problem worth focusing on its own, or if more self-compassion actually automatically ends up guiding you toward tone that can be more easily heard by the other person. And maybe, I don't know, maybe sometimes it's not my problem. It's like they got to deal with their own shit about whether me criticizing their work causes them to feel fragile and delicate.
From the self-compassionate standpoint, Roy, recognizing that you have a particular tone that comes off that way, be kind to yourself about that, right? You recognize sometimes I do that and I realize that it could be off-putting to somebody else. I'm not the only person who has this type of tone. There's other people that come from, similar background to me. So it's about acknowledging it. And if you choose to change it because you believe that it's truly problematic, then you can. And being compassionate for the person doesn't mean that you need to change your personality, but it might be getting to better understand what are their emotions, what are their unmet needs, and then what actions can be taken to help meet those unmet needs.
Sort of applying judgment to, sometimes I've thought to myself, you know what, I overdid it. I could have done it differently. Sometimes I've thought to myself, really, I could have done it differently, but what a high bar. And sometimes I've thought to myself, you know what, I'm not going to change the way I did that. That person's just going to have to figure it out, or I'll pay the price of them not figuring it out.
Yeah, but at what point does, overly judging ourselves help? I mean, there's enough data in that we can say we can do better and then we can move on.
Well, no, but you are applying some discernment. Judgment, not in the sense of I'm good or bad, but in the sense of every time you select an action to take among choices, you are judging, you are making a judgment. And so I don't mean in an emotionally loaded sense. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts, Massimo, before we break on this wonderful, full, and because of it, unusually long episode of This Is Not Advice?
I would just say that when anybody is thinking about trying to be more compassionate for other people, get better at being compassionate for yourself. It is a lot harder. We're all overly critical of ourselves, but being able to do it for yourself makes it so much easier. Compassion begets compassion.
I love that. Well, thank you for that. And I feel like your example and coaching are already useful for many and going to be useful for many more. If, like I said earlier, if people want to see other episodes, and eventually we'll transcribe this one and put it up, you can just go to thisisnotadvice.work, not .work.com, but just .work. And, the reason we say it's not advice is neither Massimo nor I, who in some ways lived very different lives. And in some ways we share a lot of stuff in common. Like the way we look to others, it's like, two white guys talking to each other with office jobs. And so people have to figure out their own paths. And I'm just really grateful for having your effect on the world and for the Hoffman process for bringing us together. Yes. And looking forward, to be continued.
Thank you, Roy.